It is a real pleasure to be able to be here with you today, although if I had a suggestion for next year's Iowa Pork Congress, I might suggest somewhere a little further south, maybe Cancun or Aruba, somewhere like that. But it was also very cold when I left Indiana yesterday, too, so we share that in common. So I'm going to talk to you this today. Don't really have a single unifying theme, but really rather I thought I'd just talk on a number of topics that I see sort of facing the industry and share with you some of my reactions. Hopefully you'll consider them insights and thoughts about these issues facing the industry. So here's a bit of an agenda for this morning. First, going to just start by setting the stage. Like, what are the issues that have been going on? I am an economist, so I can't get away with not showing you some slides of, prices and quantities and that kind of stuff. But I want to set the stage a little bit by asking what's happened over the last couple of years and how is that affecting the conversations that we're having right now about the future of the pork industry. So the other bullets there, the other topics, I'm going to spend some time talking a bit about concentration issues, capacity, resiliency. Of course, that's something that's just came out of the White House earlier this month. Sustainability, ESG issues, how that relates to innovation. Might talk a little bit about some of the emergence of innovation outside the industry, like the new plant-based meat alternatives that could be affecting the pork industry. Depending on how time goes, may talk a little bit about some of the inflationary pressures, why I think that's happening, and then finally talk a little bit about some of the politics around meat consumption. And I got at least one slide on Prop 12. Couldn't get away with not saying something about that today. So where are we at and what's been happening? So these are data just showing weekly hog slaughter numbers relative to the 2019 average. And there's a lot of movement up and down there, but of course you see the big drop-off that happened about a year ago in May and June of 2020 when we had the shutdown in the pork packing plants. And but one of the things I want you to notice from this graph, though, is actually for a lot of this time period, for the last couple of years, we're actually producing more pork than we were in 2019, despite some of those shutdowns. The other thing you might notice is it's not uncommon to have big dips like that. Where are those other dips happening? They're holidays. So Christmas, 4th of July. But what made this period so concerning was it was an unexpected dip. So we typically know when a holiday is going to come up and we anticipate and plan around the reductions in pork consumption, production that are going to happen then. But despite the fact that that event was now almost 2 years ago, a year and a half or 2 years ago, is that time period is still having a major effect on current discussions around the pork industry and the meat industry more broadly. Prices, what's been happening with prices? So these are values, they're farm, wholesale, and retail pork values expressed relative to January 2020. A lot of volatility, a lot of movement there. Actually, back this summer was a really good time at the farm level in terms of pork prices. Come down here a bit recently. If I was able to update these prices, actually there's been some more positive movement in the last few days and weeks. But I think the dynamics here, again, I think are interesting in the sense that a lot of the discussion is focused on that one period right there and what happened when we had this divergence between farm level hog prices and wholesale meat prices. From an economic perspective, that gap made sense to me. It wasn't fun, but it made sense because if you have a shutdown in the packing sector, what does that do? It means there's too many hogs out there relative to the ability to process them, so the value of any individual hog falls. So, hog prices have to be, depressed a bit. At the same time, we're putting less meat on the market, less meat to go around. Consumers are still bidding against each other for the whatever amount of meat is available. That's going to pull up those wholesale prices. So from an economic standpoint, that widening makes some sense, even though it wasn't pleasant at all. The other interesting dynamic here is despite a lot of the national attention on retail prices, what we as consumers pay, a lot of the movement has been in the farm and wholesale prices. In fact, those two actually move together quite closely. If we can look at quantities and prices, but we can combine those to make an inference about supply and demand conditions. So this is a demand index and a supply index, and this is a longer period of time, going back to the early 2000s, expressed relative to that. So the top blue line is demand, wholesale demand for pork, U.S. pork. You can see that, you know, the trend there is positive and increasing. In other words, U.S. pork producers have done a fantastic job expanding demand for pork products. A lot of that's because of strong export demand, but also because of demand here in the U.S. You can see the last year or two, actually, despite a lot of the pandemic, a boost in demand there. The red dashed line is a supply index. It's basically an estimate of marginal cost of production, and you can see that's come down quite considerably. A lot of that's because of the really strong improvements in productivity and efficiency that the industry has seen. But what I want you to note is at the very tail end of that is this really big increase in those marginal costs. So what's going on there? Well, one thing is feed's more expensive. So this is a change in corn and soybean prices expressed relative to the start of January 2020. So if you're a corn or bean farmer, it's good news. But you got those. If you're the hog producer, that's an extra cost to you, and we're seeing that reflected in prices. They talked about the demand a little bit, and this is just data on the share of U.S. pork production that is exported. Very positive trend, and so we're the last couple of years, and the projections for the next year ahead is about a quarter of all U.S. pork production is exported. Where is it going? I mean, China's been in the news a lot. China, this is just the share of pork going to different countries. The little dashed line there is China. And indeed, in 2020, a lot of pork went to China, but you can see here more recently, it's countries like Mexico and other locations that have picked up a lot of that pork consumption. So, that's a little bit of a stage setting, and I think some of that, price and quantity fluctuation that we see has led to these conversations we're having around concentration and which relate to capacity and resiliency. So I want to share with you a few of my thoughts there. Back last summer, we were already starting to see a lot of discussion here, mainly in the form of lawsuits that were being leveled against the industry. A lot of this was focused particularly on the beef sector, but some of it in the pork sector too, where various groups were suing packers, or even some farm groups suing packers related to pricing issues. More recently, as I mentioned, though, the White House came out with this announcement earlier this month, planning to spend about $1 billion on these issues. There's a bit of a breakdown for you in terms of what they say they're going to build, spend that on, but about $600 million or so of that is targeted towards extra capacity, either in the form of grants or subsidizing loans, lending towards some of those. And then there's a variety of different spending in some different areas there. So first, let's talk about what's maybe driving this, and maybe what what I do agree with in some of that announcement, which is that the industry is fairly concentrated. So these dots here, the red dots are the 15 largest pork packing plants. In fact, if we from sitting here in Des Moines, if we drew a couple 100-mile radius around us, we'd have probably half the pork production capacity in the U.S. Pretty easily. The blue dots there are beef, the 10 largest beef packing plants. So combined, those dots there are producing about 60% of all pork and beef in the country. So it is in some senses a relatively concentrated industry. And I think the thought is, well, maybe if we dump a bunch of money out there, we'll add a bunch more dots across the country. And that will be a system that's more resilient and would be more beneficial perhaps to producers. From my view, the conversation is much more nuanced than that, more complicated than that. So maybe one way to think about it is just what is the cost of adding more capacity? So I don't know exactly what the construction costs are at the moment, but if I just look at news stories of the costs of production, the construction costs associated with a couple of the more recent large-ish packing plants that have put in, a rough guess might be, $25,000 per head of daily capacity some of you in the room might have a better number than that. But let's just take that as a given. And the question might be is, well, let's suppose that almost half of the dollars the administration said it wants to put into building new capacity was spent on pork. So let's say $200 million gets dumped into pork. What would that do at that cost? Well, it'd add about 8,000 head per day capacity, which is not nothing, but it's, represents about 1.7% of all, U.S. pork production. It's about if all that was in one plant, it wouldn't even show up on that map I showed you before, because it's not large enough to be in there. So, if this amount of money is really about adding capacity, it's not going to do a lot. Again, it's not nothing, but it's certainly not a huge dent in the capacity issue. I should have mentioned too, the MPPC just released a report the other day with some of my friends and colleagues, Dermot Hayes and Barry Goodwin, about some of these dynamics. And as they pointed out, if you actually look at pork packing, concentration actually fallen a bit over the last few years as some new packers have brought facilities online. The other way to think about this, though, is what does it really mean to be more resilient? And I think that's more challenging. The way I think about it is what you really needed in that era where we had the real challenges of the packing plant shut down because of COVID illnesses is you just needed extra capacity sitting around. Or another way to think about it is you needed redundancy in the system, which is another way people often think about resiliency. The problem with that is it's super expensive. Imagine if you went to a lender and said, I want you to give me $100 million to build a medium-ish sized packing plant, but I'm only going to run it half full because I want that extra capacity just in case something happens. I think that lender would look at you like you're crazy, right? That's not good. That's not good. That's a proposition that's not going to make good economic sense. But that being said, I think that's the way to think about it. And maybe one way to think about it is capacity is more than just bricks and mortar. It's people. What does it take to get people there? And I think one of the things we saw the industry, probably many of you in this room have to deal with, was how can you hold hogs on farms longer? What's the flexibility you have there? That's another way of adding flex in the system there. Backups is another way to think about what it means to be more resilient. So many of you probably saw the news several months ago now when one of the big packers was shut down because there was a cyber attack, right? We actually got up and running pretty quick right after that. Why? Because they had a backup of their systems. So that's another way to think about what it means to be resilient. As we think about these issues of adding capacity, whether it's being used or not used, I think there is sort of a fundamental fact about beef and pork and chicken processing that you can't really get around, and that's this issue, economies of scale. Basically, the larger you are, the lower your costs of production. So this is from an academic paper a few years ago comparing the relative costs of large to small size plants. So the biggest one there is 4 million head per year, and all the other costs of the other sizes are expressed relative to that. So if you're a smallish plant like over here, your costs are 80% to 100% more than that big plant. And so why do I mention that? If you spend that $200 million, let's say, on smallish plants, chances are they're going to be their costs of production are going to be more expensive. And I think this graph goes a long way towards explaining why we have the level of concentration we do in the industry. It's not because of in my view, some kind of malfeasance or corporate conspiracy. It's that you need to be this big to be cost competitive. But there's only so much room for people that are this big. And the economics of packing are that you can't have a big packing plant, let it sit there empty. You need to run it close to full capacity to achieve these kinds of costs of production. So I think it's rather this economies of scale you're seeing coupled with the size of the industry that explains why we have relatively small number of largish plants. My colleague Malin and Ma and I, we've done some research just doing some mathematical speculation, you might call it. Like, what if we took the industry we have now and imagined a number of hogs similar to what we have now, but instead many smaller packers? What would that world look like? And our estimates suggest you have lower hog prices and higher retail pork prices. Why? Because it's more costly. Economies of scale that I mentioned before. it might be a little more resilient to just random shocks of shutdown, something like COVID. So in our simulations, we have a bunch of plants, and one of them just randomly gets shut down for some reason. So every plant has some probability of shutting down. And what we find is there's if you had a world in which there were many small plants, there's a somewhat smaller chance of some big reduction in output. But it's not enormous. So you're picking up perhaps a little bit of extra resiliency there in this world. So maybe to kind of tie all this together, I think there are opportunities, and I see it in my state of Indiana for sure, of people putting in extra packing capacity. So I think there's some room there. And what are the opportunities? I think there does seem to be some growing demand for some more direct-to-consumer type marketing. I think that's an opportunity there. I don't expect it to be a large share of the industry, but I think there are some opportunities there. But I think the really important thing is, and that's the advice I've given to the folks in my state when they've come to us to talk about it, is you have to recognize that economies of scale. You're not going to compete on cost. So how are you going to compete? You need a plan for how you're going to compete, and that could be on quality differentiation. Maybe you've got a certain breed, you've got quality characteristics of the meat. Maybe you're going to compete on service, either service to the consumer or service to the farmer. But you have to have a way of competing that's not necessarily, I have lower costs than you do. And I think there's opportunities there. The other thing I think that's really important for a lot of smaller processors is byproducts. So I've seen a lot of these budget analyses. For some reason, they don't come to us in the ag econ department. They go to our meat science colleagues to create their budget for their new processing facility. And they always just assume that you get the market price for your product. And everybody can probably sell the loins and the bellies at the market price. But what are you going to do with the ears and the snouts and the hearts and the kidneys and the hooves? Chances are, if you're a small processor, you're going to have to pay somebody to take those away. You're not going to get the market price for them. It's another reason there's some economies of scale there, even in the marketing, because if you have the ability to access markets, a lot of them international, that want those products, now you have not only is it not a cost to you, but it's a benefit to you. So, dealing with that issue of the so-called lesser preferred products, I think, is a major challenge for a lot of smaller producers. A lot of discussion on automation, and I think that's something that there are investments being made currently at the moment, but I think thinking about ways we can reduce our reliance on labor is going to continue to be an issue that I think is really important. Again, it gets back to the point I mentioned before that capacity is more than just about buildings. It's the ability to use those buildings that involves the people that are involved there too. I think when we think about ways of spreading risk, we do store, and I think that's it wasn't a number that I used to pay very much attention to, but, in all this world now of is there a shortage? Well, now a number you go look up is, how much is in storage? That is a way we smooth potential disruptions over time, and it's a way we continue to have to do that. One last point I'll make on this is that one concern I have, and I gave some testimony to the U.S. House a few months ago on this, is, if you just dump a bunch of money to build new packing plants, that's not going to make those packing plants profitable. And one concern I might have is we might wake up 5 years from now and have a bunch of packing plants going out of business because we have too much capacity relative to the animal inventory. So so it's not profitable for that much capacity to exist. In my view, if you want to spend federal money on this thing, what you have to do is change the incentives in the system. What's going to change to make more capacity profitable? And ways to think about that, I don't have the answers, but I think the way you think about it is, how do we lower the barriers to entry? Make it more profitable for more people to be able to compete. I don't know the answer to that, but there are probably some regulatory barriers. What are the things that are keeping more people from being able to get into business? So that's the way I think, really is the way I would want to think about that, is if the White House were to call me, and they didn't, that's the way I would have encouraged them to think about that, is what are the things you can do to affect the long-term cost structure of the industry so that it is more profitable for more packers to exist in the long run, not just here, today. So to shift gears on you for a minute and talk a little bit about, I think, some of the emergence of ESG, environment, social governance issues, sustainability, and how I view that relating to innovation. A lot of pressure right now, not just in the pork sector, but really across all of agriculture to think more about sustainability. It's really hitting, I think, retail and processing sectors pretty heavily, and as a result, it's going to come back to the farm. I think when people think about this issue, I do a lot of consumer research, they think about, what are consumers willing to pay for these things? That's not, in my view, what's causing the pressure right now. What's causing the pressure are investors. And I know you can't see all the details there. By the way, if you want any of these slides, just email me and I'll share them with you. But there's about $1 trillion of capital investment that flows into U.S. agriculture. Where does that money come from? A big chunk of that money comes from institutional investors. So think like Texas State Teachers Retirement Fund, New York, pension funds, whatever. It's those groups, and they're increasingly asking, well, if we're going to put our money into your company, hold shares of your company or anything else, you're going to have to adopt various ESG criteria. That's where a lot of the pressure is coming from. And so you have, and I think the challenge for a lot of, let's say food retailers or food processors is their ability to, change climate emissions within their four walls is pretty small. So to really make big changes, they have to reach back into the supply chain and get some credit there. I think all this is going on at a time when we're having, we're in the middle, I think, of something of a digital revolution in agriculture. We have more sensors, we're collecting more data. We have, a lot of vertical integration too, so that ability to collect data and move it throughout the supply chain is increasing the ability to track and quantify various, ESG metrics. One thing I will talk about, though, is maybe as an aside before getting back to how we think about it productively, is I think when we think about sustainability, I think it is a challenging subject, and I think in talking about it to consumers is often a moving target. And so maybe to talk about that, I think one of the challenges here is it's a really complex issue, and consumers don't always do well with complex. And so it creates something of a treadmill, I think. So to give you a bit of an example of that, 15 years, this was the cover of Time magazine, back when Time actually printed a magazine. I don't know if they still do anymore, but this was a cover about 15 years ago. And you can see the sticker there said, "Forget organic, eat local." And I think that's just sort of symptomatic of a broader kind of cyclical trend of fads and fashions that sort of relate to sustainability issues. So it was organic that was really fashionable, then it was local, then it became sustainable, and then now the word seems to be regenerative. I don't know what's going to be next. There's probably another one. I'm not cool enough yet to know exactly what that is. Of course, we see that sort of thing in diets all the time too, right? It was low fat, and then low carb, high protein. Now it seems to be plant-based. Clean labels is another one that's on there. These things sort of rise and fall over time. Why do we see these kind of cyclical patterns? I think there's a number of drivers. So what causes sort of the upcycle? What causes one of these movements to gain in popularity? I think one is that consumers and investors do have underlying concerns for things like environmental outcomes, health, animal welfare. They do care about these things. Now, they're not always willing to pay enough to cover the cost for them, but they do care about them, so that provides a platform for people to appeal to those underlying preferences that consumers have. In addition to that, I think there's always a kind of a yearning, for right or wrong. Consumers, want some authenticity out of their food. They want to feel, some, trust in the food system. And that often gets tied up in sort of a bit of what I would think about as a kind of a romanticism around small and, quote unquote natural, whatever that might mean. So I think that kind of underlying sentiment of consumers sets the stage then for different kinds of appeals to those underlying preferences. The other thing that matters too is, as we've become wealthier as a country, food has become, a relatively small share of our income. So we can show off by showing that I can afford more expensive food, right? So I can have the little horse on my shirt that shows I'm special. I can spend a little more on a piece of cloth that's otherwise perfectly, identical to yours. The other thing I think that, in the complexity of things related to sustainability and ESG is that consumers don't like all that complexity. It's easier for them to think about silver bullets. If I buy the local, that solves all the problems. It's better for the environment, it's tastier, it's healthier, it's all those things. So I think, when an issue becomes new, it's easier for people to attach all those hopes and dreams to that as solving multiple problems. And then often there's some, core group of people that really believe in the idea and sort of pushes it into the mainstream. So then what causes it to sort of start to wane? And I should say it doesn't mean it always drops. Organic, of course, is still here. Market show's growing. So it's not as if it went away. It's just maybe perhaps not quite as fashionable as it once was. Well, one reason is as a claim, a movement gains steam, there becomes a need for standardization, right? If we're going to sell something that has a label on it that says, regenerative, which there's not one right now. That's the problem right now, is nobody knows exactly what it means. And so because you don't know what it means, it's easier for you to attach all your hopes and dreams to it because I can impose my own thoughts on what it should mean. But if you're a Walmart and you want to put that label on your shelf, all of a sudden you've got to decide, what does it mean? Or the USDA, in the case of organic, says, here are the standards, here's what it means. And you actually need those standards for that movement to grow so that it can gain some credibility over time. And of course, because you're adding standards, that's going to alienate some of the true believers. So again, let's take organic. And one recent example is there was a fight over whether hydroponic agriculture can be classified as organic. And there was a fight there. I think the hydroponics, if I'm not mistaken, won out. But some of the other folks said, well, that's antithetical to our vision of what organic means, so now organic is not worth anything to me anymore. So that's one of the challenges. Of course, science evolves too. We study things. We don't really know the effect of, organic or local or whatever. But as you study local, what you start to find out is actually the transportation is a very small share of the overall environmental impact. So maybe it's not necessarily the best for the environment. We didn't know that before. It took research and evidence to show it. And then, of course, something gains kind of in popularity. Big companies get into it. They help bring down the cost. That does, spread the appeal of it. But then it, makes it look a little corporatized. And a lot of these movements, that sort of trustworthiness, appeal to natural and small, that's antithetical to those ideals. So almost in some ways, the fact that it gets big and mainstream makes it less appealing. And then lastly, if everybody can have a shirt with the horse on the side, it's not cool anymore. It's only cool when you're the only one that can do it, and your friends. So mainstreaming removes some of that prestige. So that's not going to go away. I think that these are these sort of cycles, ebbs and flows of kind of fashionable food aren't going to go away. But what can we do to think about it maybe in a productive way? So one is, I think we can try to be more science-based, so that we can be consumers are not necessarily attaching a bunch of false hopes and dreams to it, and also there's some evidence behind it. So I think the metrics of what it means to say be sustainable are really important, and who gets to decide those. I'm going to make the case even more in just a moment that I think productivity should be a key measure of sustainability. So that's the one I would advocate for. And how do we improve productivity? Innovation, in my view, is one of the best ways to do that. So I think about innovation as kind of having your cake and eat it too. You get to eat your pork that you enjoy, your bacon, your pork tenderloin sandwich, but have it while it's having a lower environmental impact. Like, that's having your cake and eat it too. How do we do that? Well, we have to innovate, and we have to find new ways to do things. And again, we're seeing ways that are emerging that can maybe help us do that a little more in the future as we coordinate those data across those. I think one interesting dynamic there will be is, there will be opportunities, I think, for entrepreneurs and current people in the industry where there's going to be real advantages to who has the information and who's tracking these supply chain metrics. I think there'll be some real opportunities and interesting there. And the hope is maybe with some quantification, standardization, that might help break some of this treadmill. One way I think about it is if you have a nutrition facts panel on food. You got the number of calories, you got the amount of protein. Any consumer can look at it and sort of know, and they can then decide what's important to me. Is it the nutrition? Is it the protein? Is it the amount of carbs? Now, obviously, the nutrition facts panel didn't cause fad diets to go away. But at least there is that objective information that can be used by consumers and producers. So as we think about this sort of sustainability metric, I think that's going to be, for me, an important way to think about it. I mentioned productivity, I think, as being really important facet of sustainability. So how do I think about that? First, let me characterize it in a way that we often talk about it, which is sort of we need to feed the world. So these are small graphs, but the top blue line is the amount of pork produced in the U.S. over time. The line I've created below it is a counterfactual prediction. It asks the question, how much pork would we have produced if we would have never improved yield, the amount of pork produced per pig? And then the difference between those two lines is this black line below. So that's essentially the extra amount of pork we get because we've improved productivity. We figured out how to get more pork from each pig. So, these days we're producing about, I think that's 400 million more pounds of pork per month because of improved productivity. And often the story, I think, in agriculture we tell ourselves is that's a great thing because we've got a growing world population and we need to feed that world population. And I think that's true. But I think the sustainability story is we can turn this story sort of on its head. These graphs look almost the same, but it's a slightly different calculation. The orange line now is the actual number of hogs we have had in the United States over this time period. The blue line above it is the number of hogs we would have needed to produce the amount of pork we actually consumed in any one of those years if we wouldn't have increased productivity. And then this black line is the difference between those. I call this the number of pigs we saved. So about 2 million. About 2 million, we would have needed an extra 2 million pigs per month had we not improved productivity and still wanted to enjoy the amount of pork consumption that we had today. And that's, to me, a real powerful story about sustainability. We could we can enjoy this amount of pork we have, but many fewer animals, eating less feed, drinking less water, having lower impacts on climate emissions, all those things because we found ways to improve productivity. So where's that innovation coming from? What are the future innovations? I don't have all the answers here. Actually, it's fun to walk around on the exhibition floor down there to see some of the interesting stuff. I saw some companies selling some AI, not the artificial insemination, but rather artificial intelligence, things to monitor the pigs when they're in the thing, detect if they have disease before you can even see it in your eye. This sort of machine learning stuff is really interesting. I was in a conference 2 weeks ago. There were some Silicon Valley guys that were building robots to pick strawberries, and they were talking about machine learning and robotics, and they're like, the machine learning stuff is solved. I was like, whoa, I thought we're still trying to invest a bunch of research into this sort of thing. So the science is really interesting there. Gene editing, vaccines, the ASF, I know there's a session right before this on that topic. There's some vaccines that are, in the process there, but I think a lot of us in this room probably have been vaccinated against the coronavirus with an entirely new technology that didn't exist a few years ago. When can we start deploying some of those technologies in the pork industry? I think that's an exciting thought. We talked about robotics. A lot of really interesting research working on our gut, microbes, both for humans but also for animals as well. And of course, productivity. We want to get more meat from each animal. But let's not forget about quality, right? We don't want to just put out a bunch of pounds that people don't want to eat. So, we got to think about ways we also make that pork tastier, more flavorful, how it's packaged, how it's used, make it more convenient for consumers too. I think all that innovation is certainly out there. So, as we talk about innovation, one of the innovations that maybe is happening outside the industry, I'm just going to check the time here, make sure I don't go too long, is the emergence of the plant-based meat alternatives. So these are not your, grandfather's soy burger. These are, newer products, think the Beyond Meat or the Impossible Foods that really do try to mimic the texture and taste of meat. What are consumers thinking about these? First of all, I think, it is a competitive threat to the industry, but where is it going, and what kind of dent might it have on demand for pork? This is a survey that Glenn Tonser and I do every month, partially funded by the National Pork Board, on consumer preferences. So we give people a question like the one you see at the top of if you're shopping for your household and you had to pick one protein for dinner, which one would it be? And there's a set of prices. And what I'm showing you here is just the share of people in each of these months that chose each of these products. So here's pork chop, for example. About 15% of people chose the pork chop out of that set of 9 options. But here's your plant-based patty, around 3%. It doesn't really seem to be gaining a lot of extra adherence over time. Looks pretty stable to me. People might say, well, those are products that are attempting to replicate a beef burger. In pork, we're isolated. I'm not sure that's entirely true. So if I use some mathematical simulations, I ask the question of that, of that 3% market share, that 3% of people choosing it, what would they have chosen if the plant-based patty wasn't there? And about 14% of them would have chose the pork chop. So it's, again, 14% of 3% is not a huge number, but it's not nothing. So there's some impact there. What about price sensitivity? So like Impossible has announced a while back they're going to try to bring down their prices by 20% over the coming months. So our estimates from these data we collect suggest a 10% reduction in a plant-based price would reduce bacon and pork by about 1.2 to 1.4%. So there is some impact there. But it's way more important what happens to pork prices, right? A 10% reduction in pork prices causes a 30% increase in bacon production and a 24% increase in pork chops. So in other words, back to that productivity story, making sure pork is affordable and competitive is way more important than worrying about what's happening to the prices of the plant-based alternatives, at least at the moment. Just real briefly, this is a study we did for the beef industry. So sorry I don't have these questions for pork, but I suspect they'd be similar. And then as we just asked people, which of these 2 products do you think is better for a whole bunch of dimensions in terms of taste, price, convenience, freshness, nutrition, a beef burger or a plant-based burger? And you can see that red line is universally higher across the board. Where it gets closer is things not surprisingly on animal welfare and environment. It gets a little more similar. But all this is a way of saying that despite a lot of negative publicity, people still have very positive views about, in this case at least, beef production. But I assume we would find similar results for pork products. But where are these products competing? Environment, concerns about environment and animal welfare. So to the extent those things become more important to consumers in the future, you might expect there to be a bigger shift there. One story you don't see a lot is, about 2 years ago, you were probably seeing articles that were showing this massive increase in sales growth of these plant-based alternatives. But these data come from grocery store scanner data. What this is showing you is the change in sales in a given week relative to the same week 1 year prior. The big blue kind of line that's kind of going up like this, that's turkey. And that's Thanksgiving. So in other words, people bought a lot, they spent a lot more on turkeys this Thanksgiving than they did last Thanksgiving, which makes sense because the pandemic was in a slightly better spot this year than it was last year. The thing I want you to pay attention to, this black line, are the meat alternatives. It's negative. So it appears, for whatever reason, that sales growth has actually really leveled off and in fact has fallen a bit over the course of the last year and a half. I don't know entirely what's going on there. It is a little bit mysterious. One of my interpretations is, and we can also see this in some of our survey data, is that some of the motivation for trying these products was novelty. People wanted to try something new, test it out, see how it was, and maybe what they're not seeing are perhaps those repeat purchases. So my take-home message with regard to the plant-based protein is you should pay attention to it because it is a competitive threat, but at the moment you don't need to lose sleep over it. That it doesn't appear like it's going to take over the world in the near term, but you got to, might be among your set of factors you're keeping in your eye. Keep your eye out there. So I think there are a lot of interesting opportunities there. The meat case looks different than it did before. You got a bunch of these new plant-based alternatives. It could open up some opportunities that weren't there before as people reconsider like what is meat. Blended products, for example, could be an opportunity. Pork and mushroom, pork and something else. What are the pork options that consumers aren't thinking about, they might think of before? I don't know how this industry can recreate the chicken sandwich wars, but what's the pork product that could do that too? That's the sort of thing I think would be interesting to think about. in the long term, to the extent these plant-based products really start to gain some traction, how does the pork industry compete? Interestingly, I think the ingredient list of one ingredient is a pretty powerful argument there, and I think that's one that'll go forward, although you've got to balance that against the fact that we do need to use science and technology and sometimes some things to improve productivity as well. But I think, taste, not just quantity of protein, but what types of protein seems to be a really important issue going forward, where I think traditional meat products compete relatively well against some of these plant-based products. Okay, I'm going to move on real briefly and kind of wrap up with two quick things. You've probably seen the headlines. Inflation is out there. I just want to share a few thoughts about what I think is going on there. So first off, a little plug for some research we have at Purdue. You can go to this address. We've created this little tool where you can pick which food you want to look at and look at what's happening to those prices over time, either compared to last month or compared to last year or compared to any date in the past you want to pick. It'll compare those. So this is the latest data we have on price, on inflation and food prices is from December. But as of December, total inflation, so food and non-food, was running about 7% on a year-over-year basis. That's a number we haven't seen since roughly the 1980s. So that's one of the reasons you're seeing a lot of headlines. And then in particular, food is just lagging that a bit, about 6%. It's been running about that for the last several months. And then you can see beef, here's pork, at about 15% higher than it was the previous year. So this is what's been capturing all those headlines and probably motivating some of what you've seen in that White House document there too. So why are we seeing this? I already alluded to a little bit of it. We have some extra costs from higher feed prices. One of it is, one of those costs, though, in addition to just, on the farm thing, is, wage rates. A lot of folks are having a hard time getting labor, and when they can get labor, they have to pay them more to show up. So these are changes in weekly earnings of non-supervisory workers in meatpacking, restaurants, food manufacturing, groceries, relative to the prior to the pandemic in January 2020. So in meatpacking, wages, those total wages are up almost 20% over that 2-year time period. And pretty much every segment of the food sector, you see, much higher wages today. By the way, if you're a worker, if you had a job and you're one of the workers whose wages increased, those wages were more than the increases in food prices. So you're actually, better off because one way to think about it is you can afford more food if your wages have kept up. Now, these increases are higher than the wages sort of across the economy as a whole, and it does suggest that the wage pressures in food have been more acute than in other areas of the economy. The other thing, though, is just sort of macroeconomics. We dumped a bunch of money in the economy following the start of the pandemic. It was the stimulus payments, an increase in unemployment benefits. Many of you probably got, those checks in the mail from the government. That's this big spike. This is money supply. So that's the classic definition of inflation, is more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. So, it just means the value of any dollar is lower than it was before if there are more dollars floating around, and the way that gets manifested is in higher prices. You can also see it in savings rates. So this is the percent of income that consumers are saving. You saw a big spike. This goes back to 2000. That consumers were saving a lot of that money. Interestingly, we've come back down to a more sort of a number more in line with what we're accustomed to seeing. So maybe this is some evidence, at least on the consumer demand side, that perhaps that might start to tail off a little bit there. This is the market's expectation of inflations. One way you could do this is you look at what bonds that are inflation-protected Treasury bonds. Compare that price to bonds that are not inflation protected, and that gives you an estimate of sort of what the market thinks is going to happen to inflation. So you can see there's a big increase, but it's sort of leveled off, and it's not skyrocketing just yet there. So where's it going? Everybody wants to know, is this inflation transitory, or is it going to go back to normal? And my answer is it's always transitory. We just don't know how long the transition is, right? Is it going to be in 2 months? Or 2 years, or 2 decades? I don't know. If I could answer that question, I would not be an academic economist. I would be on Wall Street somewhere. But I think it's likely to stick around with us for the next couple of months, if not longer. I'm going to wrap up by just mentioning a few things around politics of meat consumption and mentioned something about Prop 2. I think I showed you the slide on the demand story, which is really positive. And I think it's remarkable in light of a lot of the negative publicity that's hit the industry over the last several years. So dietary guidelines reports, we have the Eat Lancet report. That little slice there is like how much meat they say you should have on your plate. Other issues like the World Health Organization making pronouncements about red meat and processed meat. You would think in a lot of ways that we would have seen a really strong impact on demand, and as I've already shown you, we haven't seen it yet. Maybe another way, though, to think about it is demand could have been even stronger had these things not happened. And so these are debates I've been involved in a lot. There's me, talking to John Stossel. Are cheeseburgers killing the planet? That's with Stuart Varney. Of course, everybody wanted to talk about the meatpacking plant shutdowns on CNN and ABC and so forth. But I got a picture of Beyonce here, and that's because when I was going on John Stossel's show, back when he had a show on Fox, he was talking about Beyonce because Beyonce is a vegetarian. So he's doing this little segment about her. And as you maybe want to do, if you're going to be on TV, sometimes I record myself so I can see myself when I get back home and how I did. And so I was playing back this show, and I just happened to hit pause on my recorder as they were shifting between the segment on Beyonce to the segment with me. And for this little moment in time, Beyonce's picture was on one side of the screen, and my face was on the other side of the screen. And I like to refer to this as the time I appeared on TV with Beyonce. So, pinnacle of my career. It's all downhill since then. The point is, these issues about, meat consumption, what's it doing to health and the environment, they're, mainstream discussions. The stuff about, what was happening to meat prices it was on every major media outlet over the last few months. And I think, what impact is that going to have? And a couple of thoughts there is, despite overall demand strength, one question is, are more people becoming vegetarians or vegans or flexitarians? Our data seems to suggest yes. There's a very slight uptick in the number of people on a survey, at least, that tell you they're a vegetarian or a vegan over time. Who are those people? The biggest predictors of somebody saying, yes, I'm a vegetarian, is if you're young, liberal, female. Those are the strongest predictors. And I mentioned that liberal one to say, that suggests to you that politics get wrapped up in these discussions, too. Other, contributors that are not quite as determinative as those top three, but we do see some correlations with Western U.S. versus particularly the Midwest. Income and non-white people tend to have slightly higher rates of vegetarianism. The other thing we can see, some interesting analysis, I want to update this because I haven't looked at this in a while, but is we basically have a measure of meat demand, and I just split that measure of meat demand between conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. Maybe not surprisingly, across the board, the conservative Republicans, their demand for meat was higher than the liberal Democrats. But the interesting thing is that gap has widened over time. In other words, meat consumption is becoming a more politically polarizing issue. Maybe not surprising because you think about issues like climate change that have been linked to meat consumption and demand. Climate change is not a politically polarizing issue, is it? Of course it is. So those things seem to be bleeding over into meat consumption. The other thing we see is that this gap, it really is graded by by education. So if you have low educated consumers, basically there's no difference between the two. It's only the really highly educated consumers where you get this partisan gap between those. And one way to think about that is the smarter you are, the easier it is to fool yourself. In other words, it's easier for you to find information that supports your priors. It's also easier for you to know, what does my peer set think about what I should think on these issues. I think the unfortunate part of this graph is that it suggests that conversations around meat are going to be more challenging in the future when we talk about them. I'm going to come back to that slide. So it can't just be what does the science say on this issue. It's got to be who is communicating the science. That's going to matter more. Are they a part of my tribe, the people that I look for information? And people are going to interpret these things through their partisan lens. So I think that this polarization of meat consumption, I think, is one that's going to make conversations particularly difficult. Prop 12, I know there was a session yesterday, so I'm not going to say a lot about it other than still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen there. I think California still has not developed an actual standard for how they're going to implement this, so they seem not to be enforcing the rule at the moment, and there's still some legal issues that are pending. But just to emphasize some analysis that I did recently with Glenn Tonsor, we estimated demand for different pork products in 51 major markets around the United States. And then we took those estimates and we can do some calculations, like what happens if California, essentially, you could think about it as imposing a tax on pork products. You can see a really big impact in California. So these are quantity reductions in these different pork products in San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles. So a 10% tax would have big impacts in different across different markets and also different across different pork products. But I think perhaps the more important thing is, well, California can do whatever it wants to do, but it has impacts outside of California. So, our estimates, or my estimate, I should say, is, it might have, it'll likely cause a reduction in U.S. pork prices across the board about 2%, and in the long run, reduce pork production by about 0.5%. So, you reduce price, you reduce quantity, that reduces revenue to the pork sector over the long term. Interestingly, though, consumers in other parts of the world, just put Chicago here as an example, might consume a little bit more pork. Why? Because California is not going to be consuming as much, and if other folks don't comply, there's more pork sitting around in Chicago than would have been there before, so they might actually consume a little more. So just to wrap up, though, I think I heard that y'all had some visitors here in some of your sessions earlier from some protesters. I think that's not going to go away. I think that criticism of agriculture is probably here to stay, but I think we got to think about how to engage productively in those conversations. It might not be always with the people that are protesting, but who has an open mind, who's willing to engage on these conversations. But you got to think about it carefully. I think in light of some of the politics that get surrounded these things, that communication is going to be interpreted through a political lens, and it matters probably as much who is communicating than what is being communicated. So I think those are opportunities for us to get engaged and communicate these. I think the good news is this industry has some really positive stories to tell. I talked about the productivity story and the sustainability story. I think that's an incredibly positive story. And I think a lot of the innovations that are happening in this space are ones where we're going to have a bright future ahead, but we've got to think carefully and strategically about how we talk about those with the general public. So I know I've thrown a lot at you, but it's been my pleasure to be here, and I better stop. And I think we have some time for a few questions if somebody has one.
What?
I think you got one over here.
Thanks for your presentation. So a few slides back, you had you brought up the alternative proteins. Mm-hmm. So as an economist, have you had a chance to study the relative sustainability of, I lump it into two categories, right? The plant-based proteins and then the lab-based proteins. Have you had a chance as an economist to study where you think their trends would lead them to be in terms of sustainability? And again, sustainable both on a relative cost as well as the relative carbon footprint, for example.
Yeah. So unfortunately, most of the claims that exist out there in terms of less land use or water use or climate emissions all come from the companies themselves. So there's not a lot of peer-reviewed type of literature on that. You did mention the way I think about it as an economist, and that is the prices have to reflect resource use over time. And for most of these plant-based products, they are selling at a premium to even beef products, which suggests they're using more resources. So now maybe it's that they're still in a startup phase. They need a build bigger facilities and get those economies of scale, and they'll eventually bring those costs down. But the way I think about it is if we don't wake up 5 or 10 years from now and those products not be substantially less expensive, then we really have to question the claims that they're using a lot fewer resources. So that's sort of the economic standpoint, way I think about it. In terms of all the other things, I don't know this, otherwise I just will point out, I noticed in Europe, this announcement just came out yesterday. This was with the plant-based dairy alternatives that one of the governing bodies there forced one of the companies to remove a bunch of its claims about carbon emissions and land use because they couldn't be substantiated by the science. So I don't know, whether that's broadly true or not. Oatly was the one that kind of captured that attention. It was in the UK. So I don't know. I think it's an open area for research to be done, for sure. And look, it's very possible and even likely that a lot of these plant-based alternatives will use less land and perhaps have lower climate emissions. I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing to assume. It's really kind of about feed conversion, right? If you feed the calories straight to us humans rather than through an animal, that makes some sense to me. But that's not the only reason we consume things. We consume things because for other reasons, like we like the taste of it, and that's a perfectly legitimate reason to consume something, even if it has a slightly higher carbon emission or slightly more land use. We have to pay for that in the higher prices, but I think I have a much more nuanced view on people talk about say like carbon taxes, for example. I think most people think, well, if it's bad, if it produces carbon and we tax it, nobody will consume it anymore. But that's actually not right. Like, actually, if you think about in beef, which is the one which is the protein that has probably the biggest carbon impact, if you calculate the social cost of carbon and you put a tax on beef, it would be like maybe 25 cents a pound more expensive. So the question you should ask yourself is, how much less beef would I eat if it was 25 cents more per pound? You still eat a whole heck of a lot of beef, probably, right? And so I think, that, well, anyway, I think I've said what I wanted to say on there without going on another soapbox.
Any other questions for Dr. Lusk?
Hey, Jamie?
Yeah?
I think you can hear me. I'm curious when you talk about concentration. Take a look at the history of retail price spread. What's happened to the producers' share? What's happened in processing has been about stable.
Mm-hmm.
The growth has come at the retail level, the retail wholesale.
Yeah.
Other than Senator Klobuchar asking in a hearing one day, is anybody looking at the retail side of this thing, consolidation?
Yeah. So you are right. If you look at just those, marketing margins, the price spread between, say, price of a hog on a farm versus the wholesale price of meat versus that retail price we pay as consumers, where most of the change has been on the retail level. You're right about that. I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is those price differences are not always can be, but are not always a good reflection of, say, market power, because they've got to reflect costs too. And so if we think about, a lot of the food products we buy today, they look a lot different than they did 20, 30 years ago. There's more packaging, more processing, more transportation. And so that those costs have to drive some of those wedges too. I also think, speaking of food retailers, that's a pretty low margin business too. If you look at sort of financial statements of some of the big retailers, they're like a 2%, kind of margin business. So these are not extraordinarily profitable. Doesn't mean they don't necessarily have some market power. My colleague who I mentioned earlier that we're working on a paper together, she has a separate paper where she looked at this issue of market power. Is the market power between the packer and the farmer or between the packer and the retailer? She finds much stronger evidence of it between the retailer and the packer than between the packer and the farmer. So I don't know. I think it's a good question to ask. I think it's a question to do some research about. I do think these price spreads are not the best evidence of whether there's sort of market power or manipulation there, but I think it's a legitimate question to ask. And is it just cost? Are those added? Is it more than just added costs that we've picked up at the retail sector? or is there something else going on there? Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. There hasn't been good research on that. So I think one of the things we'll probably start to see, actually, because of what we're living through over the past couple of years, is we're likely to see a lot more academic research in the next 3 to 4 years on these topics. And I think that's a good thing, because to be frank, a lot of the research that I'm using to inform my views about the industry is about 10 or 15 years old. So it's probably good that we're taking another look at some of these issues and seeing if the views that we formed based on the research, 10, 15 years ago is still true today. I think that's important for us to do from time to time.